And now, let us introduce our fourth panel discussion on the geopolitics of Bitcoin with your moderator, Lee Bratcher. Our panelists this afternoon are Congressman Warren Davidson of Ohio, Alex GLADSTEIN, Chief Strategy Officer, Human Rights Foundation, Perry Ann Boring, President, Chamber of Digital Commerce, Ed Dolansky, former President, Boeing Global Defense, and NATALIE SMOLENSK.
All right, good afternoon. We've got our afternoon copy ready to rock and roll for the geopolitics of Bitcoin. I'm joined today by a distinguished panel of experts and thought leaders, world-class thought leaders, to talk about this subject today. I'm excited to dive into this conversation. I want to start actually with something revolving around geopolitics and around U.S. supremacy and geopolitics, not necessarily Bitcoin, that we'll dive into Bitcoin from there. So it's a level set for Ed. Ed, you're a veteran of the U.S. defense industry. You ran Boeing's largest services business, and now you've co-founded the First Watch Group, where you're working on private equity deals and advising government agencies, including intelligence agencies, the three-letter agencies. What does it mean for the U.S.? The U.S. dollar has been the world's reserve currency, and how has that been a tool for U.S. foreign policy and a projection of American power?
Not a difficult question, right? By the way, thank you for the free tan we're getting while we're up here. Lee, when you reflect on the U.S. dollar has always been a tool for storing value. It's been a medium for driving exchange, backed by gold, which we can have an entirely another discussion about how gold has fluctuated. But since the U.S. dollar is also traded in just over 60% of all countries, as you could say, as the world's currency, it makes it very easy for the U.S. to, one, fund its debt, right? It also puts us in a position where we're able to amplify, I like how one of my commanders put it, the will of the U.S. people through sanctions. Because if you trade in the dollar, we can have the effect of those sanctions. As you see the rise of cryptocurrency, for example, what's happened in El Salvador now, you and I were having a debate in the back, which was, well, what happens right now? Thank goodness we get along with El Salvador and everything's good. I have a client in El Salvador, so I'm not saying anything negative. But if you say, well, I have an issue with them and I have to put a sanction in place, how are they going to react? Okay, fine, we'll take Bitcoin now. So you start wondering, has it affected us fundamentally in that world? So I could tell you in DC and in the Virginia area, it's being watched very, very closely.
And just to expound upon that, so do you think that the world's reserve status, the dollar's reserve status in the world has changed, or is it changing? And how does Bitcoin play a role in that conversation? Is it more of a threat, or is it actually something that's going to support the dollar to remain the world's reserve currency for years to come?
First, the U.S. dollar is backed by gold. I mean, we all know that. And I was in the back over the last hour. You were watching me run through numbers because I thought, well, I had a perceived value of gold and how it's fluctuated. And then it changed as I was running some numbers. That's why I brought this out with me. Not sure if you all are aware of this, but gold started out being valued in 1793. We're traded at approximately $19.39 an ounce. Since then, it's risen 9,142%. In many times, it was the inverse of the value of the dollar. They went in opposite directions. So where I thought there'd be a correlation coefficient in the 90s, it falls somewhere in the 60s. So that caught me off guard. So you have to say, well, has gold been volatile? The answer would be yes. Then I looked at Bitcoin. And it's argued that the first Bitcoin was traded in about 2009 for a value of 0.00099 cents. And it's appreciated approximately 5,470,000% since then. So, yeah. Underscore the importance of blockchains to keep all this straight, right? So when I look at it, I think the dollar will continue to be the underpinning. I mean, when we look at Bitcoin's value, we don't talk about it, well, how many euros is that worth? It's how many dollars is it worth? I think it'll remain the underpinning value.
Marianne, so for the first time, we now have stateless, self-sovereign currency, which is Bitcoin, whose adoption is happening largely independently of governments. What considerations does Bitcoin introduce for the status of the US dollar as the world's reserve currency, and what do you feel like it means for the world?
Yeah, thanks so much, Lee. I think Bitcoin is the most important technology we are going to see in our entire generations. You just kind of went through some of the performance of Bitcoin. Bitcoin has been the best performing asset 10 out of the past 12 years. It has averaged a 250% rate of return every year over the past 10 years. It might be the best performing asset in the history of financial markets. So what does that mean for the United States? Well, I think it's absolutely essential that we harness its benefits here for Americans and also for Texans. So I am a big advocate for public policies that further support the growth and development of digital assets and Bitcoin in particular. And if we get it wrong, we have everything to lose. And I'll talk about that in more detail in the next session as well.
Yeah. Natalie, earlier this year, the chairman of the Federal Reserve, Jerome Powell, stated in a webinar sponsored by the Bank of International Settlements that Bitcoin isn't really a store of value because of its volatility. But then he compared it to gold, which has proven to be a relatively durable store of value over time. Back in 2019, Powell also compared Bitcoin to gold in a testimony before the US Senate, explicitly calling it a store of value. Why is there so much confusion in the central bank about what exactly Bitcoin is, and is it a store of value or not?
Right. No, there is a lot of confusion at the central bank level because Bitcoin actually violates the political theology of money, which the accepted wisdom is that it derives its value from the state, which is a very interesting historical development, can be traced back to the earliest coins and coinage, which was typically a state-driven activity related to the expansion of early empires and the need to pay the first standing armies in something other than trade goods. And so there's been this long historical connection between money and state that really persists as a prior or a presupposition, especially by the priests of that political theology, the central bankers. And so when an asset like Bitcoin comes along that doesn't derive its value in any way from the state, it can seem like a cognitive dissonance or almost a violation. The reality, though, is that Bitcoin has been and continues to be market tested. And not only has it proven to be a remarkable store of value, but now with the Lightning Network is also becoming the world's fastest, cheapest, and most freedom-preserving medium of exchange.
I'm glad you mentioned the Lightning Network too, because that's something that I don't think the world has really grasped the potential of. And we have years to understand its full potential, but it's on the horizon.
Yep.
Congressman Davidson. So in 2018, the St. Louis Fed stated that Bitcoin has the potential to emerge as its own asset class. It could be used as a diversification tool. What does it mean that Bitcoin is its own asset class? And does this simply mean that it's not correlated to traditional markets? Or is it more that Americans are going to use it differently?
Yeah, I mean, I think Americans, really the world is using it differently. And, I think truly one of the most important documents in all of history is going to be the Bitcoin white paper. I think everyone should read it. People won't always love it. Certainly the intelligence community doesn't uniformly love it. And authoritarians all over the world don't love it. They want to use the payment system as a way to control people. They want to use it as a means of control. And look, because the US dollar is the world's reserve currency, we've been able to do that some. We certainly did it with the Marshall Plan after World War II. Bretton Woods, it was pegged to the dollar. 71 to gold, and in 71 we broke that free. I think one of the interesting sites, WTF, happened in 1971, worth paying attention to. But with the dollar as the world's reserve currency, all the commodities in the world being settled in US dollars, we've still kept the dollar strong. And I think the point that people think of Bitcoin in terms of dollars is still important. But what it's inspired isn't just the payment system envisioned as described by Satoshi Nakamoto. It's inspired an infinite, nearly infinite use case combination with blockchain, the underlying architecture. And I think people just don't, they're in the infancy of understanding that it establishes trust in such a different way. And I think we're going to see really this era of innovation, not just in America, but in the world as a fintech revolution. You know, you saw like agriculture, industrial, automobiles in America, aviation in America, aerospace in America, computing in America, the internet age in America. Why in the world would we want to do anything but encourage fintech to flourish in America? But we haven't yet seen our government embrace that.
Hopefully soon. Mary Ann, go ahead.
Yeah, I've read this study, Lee, and I can add a little bit more context to it. But in 2018, the Federal Reserve Bank of St. Louis, as you stated, issued a report that said Bitcoin has the potential to emerge as its own asset class and may be used as a diversification tool. So there's a couple key terms there that the Fed uses, and I think it's really interesting that it's a reserve, Federal Reserve bank that talks about that. So in investment portfolios, diversification, assets for diversification are used to address volatility and risk. So Bitcoin, as stated by the St. Louis Fed, is a non-correlated asset, meaning if the stock market goes up, Bitcoin may go up. If the stock market goes down, Bitcoin may go up, may go down. It's not correlated. And what we have seen is when a small amount of Bitcoin, 1 to 5% amount of Bitcoin or cryptocurrency is put into an investment portfolio, the volatility goes down and the returns go up. So from the fiduciary responsibility, I think it's very possible that soon more people are going to understand these dynamics, and we will continue to see Bitcoin replacing gold, as Jerome Powell, the chairman of the Fed, has also talked about in his congressional testimonies as well, because of the way it performs. And so we're seeing investors replacing gold for Bitcoin. And to add on your points, I think we will also start to see potentially central banks start replacing gold for Bitcoin. And that's the tectonic shift that I believe we are seeing in the macro economy.
So true. Thanks, Mary Ann. Alex, you're joining us here straight off of the Oslo Freedom Forum in Miami, where you were teaching activists around the world to use Bitcoin safely and securely. So how do you think Bitcoin empowers ordinary people living under authoritarian regimes?
Yeah, well, thanks for having me. And I'm wearing two hats. I'm an American. I have a family in America, and I'm also a human rights activist that works with people globally. And at the end of the day, something we've mentioned here is the main reason why it's helpful to people. And we talk about the idea of store of value. But actually, that's not really accurate with Bitcoin. Bitcoin is actually a dramatic appreciator of value for the people who hold it around the world. It doesn't just sort of store your purchasing power, it multiplies it dramatically. So for example, people who got into Bitcoin even just 2 years ago have seen their ability to buy things, whether it's goods, services, food, go up by 10, 12, 15x. Meanwhile, most people live under weak currencies around the world. They don't have the privilege of using the dollar, right? So only about 10% of the world population lives under a reserve currency like the dollar or the yen or the euro, in addition to a governance construct that allows property rights, like a liberal democracy. So the other sort of 6.8, 6.97 billion people live either under an authoritarian regime or a weak currency where they see their purchasing power just sort of disappear. So first and foremost, as an appreciator of value over time, Bitcoin has made a massive impact in the lives of tens of millions of people in emerging markets. Just so you understand the data here, there's millions of people using Bitcoin in Nigeria, Argentina, Turkey, the Philippines, Ethiopia. These are large countries with 70 million, 100 million people. And this is just continuing to grow. In fact, as a reality check, there's more Indian Bitcoin users in India than there are Salvadorans. So, I think what happened in Salvador is quite important for us to look at for a variety of reasons, but we should remember that 99.98% of Bitcoin users are not in El Salvador. They're elsewhere around the world right now. And just in general, off of what someone else said earlier and what we've been describing here, since 71, the dollar's really been backed by American geopolitical power, not the convertibility of gold, of course. We've often abused that power actually around the world, and I'm not very proud of that in a lot of ways. And I think what Bitcoin does is it kind of like brings us to a society that's more kind of in our roots as a political construct when it comes to things like free speech and property rights and open capital markets. These are all things that Bitcoin will reverberate with and underscore, and it will be very bad for dictatorships over time. So like closed authoritarian regimes that don't permit property rights or free speech are going to have a really hard time with Bitcoin over the coming decades. But societies like ours, I think, can mesh with it quite well, and it might help us reduce some of the excesses that we've had and some of the, honestly, overinvestment into the military-industrial complex that we've had that have led us to make bad decisions abroad. So very optimistic about it, making us sort of more true to the original roots of the American idea.
Very thoughtful. And this is a question for all the panelists. I'm going to start down at NATALIE and we can work our way this way. Should the U.S. hold Bitcoin in its treasury, and should Texas consider it as well?
Yes, no doubt. Every country with an eye toward the future is now either quietly or publicly deliberating, holding some percentage of its treasury reserves as Bitcoin. I would like to add to what Alex said about our foreign policy history and usage of the dollar as a tool of economic sanctions. This, I would say, perhaps one of the major shifts happening now is that this tool is going away. Its efficacy will decrease, not to say that it couldn't possibly be used, but as we shift to a world where Bitcoin is in effect akin to an SDR, special drawing rights, there really isn't as much power left for economic warfare through sanctions. And I think this is actually going to be a massive boon for human societies. We've seen time and again how economic sanctions actually tend to empower authoritarian regimes while punishing the people of those countries. They rarely have achieved the types of policy objectives that we've said out loud we're trying to achieve with them. And so Bitcoin empowers marginalized people not only by giving them individually a tool to save, to spend peer-to-peer, but also by defanging some of the tools that have been used to enforce an international order that may or may not be a reflection of justice.
To you, and you're welcome to agree, disagree, talk about we don't have to all say, oh yes, we should hold it. Maybe there's some concerns that you have, or maybe not.
Now I see why you built this diverse panel. Now I'm understanding. First I could say yes, we should hold it. I guess just because of my background and what I've done, there are important elements of sanctions. Now, I completely align with the panel when it comes to human rights and those that are impacted by it that have nothing to do with the dictator's horrible decisions. But I guess the thing that I find myself thinking about is, okay, if we lose the power of sanctions, what happens in North Korea? They already got the ability to hit the West Coast. We know that. What happens in Iran? Do they get nuclear weapons? If they do, how long is it before Israel gets hit? So you start wondering, okay, if sanctions are going to lose their effectiveness, what other mechanism is there? It comes, and again, I'm not going to get into a debate over, is the U.S. right or wrong to project our will? I do like my freedom, by the way, and I do like the fact we can sit in here, and I'm not worried about somebody with a bomb coming in one of those doors. So I don't have a problem with someone violating my privacy. I have nothing to hide. So I do respect our agencies and what they do for us for that fact. But what I struggle with and what I find myself thinking about is how you got two options when you're wanting to counter someone who's arrived, try not to use a word that I don't want recorded. You can use kinetics, which is the last thing you want to do, or you can use economics. And if you use that economic lever, what happens when people get into power that all they have is kinetics? That's what I worry about. That keeps me up at night.
So you mentioned the safety and security. We're sitting in here. Before, Carrie Ann, I'm going to throw the same question to you in just a moment. I wanted to share a very brief story about the Texas DPS state troopers that are kind of protecting us. You've seen them walking around today. One of them, it came up to me just a few minutes before we came on stage and said, "Hey, I just downloaded Coinbase and I bought $100 for the Bitcoin." I don't know if you can hear me right now. He's standing out, probably guarding the door, but it's resonating with, it's rubbing off on people that were around. So, Carrie Ann, same question to you.
I don't think the question is should they. I think it's more of a when, not an if question. I think it's inevitable. I don't think there's any pushing the Bitcoin toothpaste back in the tube. This is happening. It's a slowly and suddenly type thing. I think we're on I think you can apply an S-curve analysis to the adoption of Bitcoin. There's already 40 million Americans that own some form of cryptocurrency today. It's estimated that 50% of millennials own some form of cryptocurrency today in the United States. I think it's only a matter of time before a government is a reflection of its people. This is truly the will of the people, and this is going to change what the states and governments hold as treasuries. So I think it's happening. It's a matter of timing. And for those who are not at the forefront, are going to look a lot different than those who are. So I think this is a really important thing we should be talking about. And I think a lot of the dynamics both of you kind of speak to are those bigger questions that people need to figure out. But let's not lose sight of this bigger picture of the Bitcoin standard is happening. And you don't want to be left behind.
And we need these kinds of substantive policy discussions because without the regulators and without our elected officials on the same page, we could risk going too far down the road without bringing them along with us. Is that a little bit more of what I'm hearing you saying as well?
Well, yeah, and I mean, I think the other point when we talk about warfare and Chris Giancarlo is one of our advisory board members at the Chamber of Digital Commerce, and he started the Digital Dollar Project. And one of the things that he's talked about is sanction has really kept us from, has prevented warfare, because instead of launching some type of attack, you just cut them off from the financial system. So I think that's an important thing we need to take into account and understand better. But again, this is happening. The Bitcoin standard is going to happen. And I think warfare over time is changing from guns and bullets and kinetics into cyber warfare. And those type of capabilities are really important to be able to understand and to operate in today. And that's where I really think, government's focus should be from a defense perspective.
Yeah. And go ahead.
Lee, I want to make a point. You are exactly right. The next large conflict is not going to start with a bang. It's going to start with my ATM doesn't work. Why is my bank account zero?
Yeah, I mean, we're already seeing
it's already happening today, but that is where it's heading. And again, you get back to, well, how do you counter that? How do you counter a foreign government that is apparently supporting ransomware attacks? How do you counter that other than kinetics or sanctions? So you get into that debate now.
So just the 2 points before I get into should the U.S. government own Bitcoin? I'll keep you in suspense on my answer, but I think
I want to modify the question for you. So
okay.
do this and then I'll modify.
Okay. I think the sanctions thing is so important for us to discuss. In the human rights world, we've actually shifted more to something called smart sanctions, because if you look at the outcome of countrywide sanctions over the last 30 years, it's been a very poor outcome. People have suffered dramatically, while the leaders of those countries have managed to find the goods, services, weapons, whiskey, whatever Kim Jong-un and the Iranian mullahs and the Cubans want, they end up getting anyway, and they haven't gone anywhere. So those sanctions don't really work really well, and the people get hurt really bad. So what we've seen is the rise of something called smart sanctions, which do have an economic component, but they also have other components that won't change if the monetary substrate changes. So for example, why do you become a dictator or an oligarch? In a lot of ways, it's so that you can own property in, Malibu or in, for example, London, and send your kids to Harvard or LSE. Well, those things can actually be stopped, regardless of what money people use. I understand that like dictators are always going to find ways to get around, money controls, and Bitcoin may make that easier for them. But smart sanctions are kind of a hope for a future where we can still impose penalties on international human rights violators who want to come and use the West for its trappings and for the benefits it provides its population. So I wouldn't rule out the efficacy of sanctions in a Bitcoin standard at all. The second thing is, I think it's great to talk about the ATM example. That is an attack that happens on people all over the world. In February, there was a coup in Myanmar, in Burma, and the government turned off the banks. And, Bitcoin use is not terribly widespread there. And, I know some Burmese who are Bitcoin users, and I was able to get them money during that time just using my phone. Others weren't so lucky. So under a Bitcoin standard, the government has a lot less ability to terrorize its own people. And I think that's actually quite important.
That's great. So alter the question, I want to alter the question a little bit for you, just given what you do. Which country do you think will announce first that it has Bitcoin on its treasury?
Yeah. Well, look, it was shocking to the Bitcoin community that
In addition to El Salvador, I should say.
that the first country to come out and proudly kind of say we're adopting Bitcoin was El Salvador, which is like a U.S. ally that's dollarized, like kind of strange. A lot of people thought it would be some rogue regime or something like that. But it was also shocking was that it was to do medium exchange and do a payment network with Lightning. That's what the Chivo wallet's really aiming to do, is to change remittances through Lightning, which is also surprising. Now, of course, you've seen Bukele say they bought 700 Bitcoin, and that's on the government's balance sheet somewhere, right? We've also seen that like other sovereign countries have exposure to Bitcoin. Like, so for example, the Singaporean sovereign wealth fund is invested in Bitcoin companies, and the Norwegians and the Swiss have investments that are exposed to MicroStrategy and things like that. So we're starting to see it shift. But I would say the next big country will probably be Ukraine. Ukraine will be very interesting because they're an important kind of NATO ally in the fight against Putin. But the leadership is very bullish on Bitcoin. A lot of Ukrainian politicians have disclosed large Bitcoin holdings, and they're already renting out their excess nuclear power to Bitcoin miners. So there's a lot of things happening in Ukraine that would point to maybe Ukraine being one of the next countries. And I also just want to answer the question. I think it's really important for the United States as an American, not as a human rights activist, but just as an American, to take the lead on incorporating Bitcoin into our infrastructure, not just internally, but externally. I really hope the State Department sees the power in Bitcoin as a tool for foreign aid. I mean, this idea that we have to spend months filling out paperwork to move money from DC to Kenya or somewhere like that to help people is a dinosaur idea. We don't have to do that anymore. We can send money instantly directly to the person and verify that they've got it and move along. So we're wasting, in some cases, 50, 60, 70% of a $20 million grant to help agricultural subsidies in some country today because we're not using Bitcoin. So I think hopefully state and USAID and all these organizations will be allowed by Treasury, which right now is not very happy about Bitcoin. Hopefully they'll be allowed to experiment with this because I think it'll really boost our ability to help people around the world.
You bring up a great point. You bring up a great point too about monetary policy in El Salvador already having a dollarized economy. Zimbabwe, dollarized economy with US dollar and South African rand. There's several others. Ukraine would be significant though, right? Because they're
not dollarized. They have monetary discretion. They can print whatever money they want. So if they add Bitcoin as legal currency, legal tender, that's a big deal.
It's a huge deal. And that would, they had this monetary and fiscal policy that they would be sort of sacrificing in a way, but sacrificing but also gaining quite a bit.
We don't know that. I mean, maybe the first Bitcoin economy's fiat money becomes strong. I mean, it's possible that just like fiat money used to be backed by gold, it's possible you can have promises to pay backed by Bitcoin. I mean, we're going to all experience it over the coming decades. We're all going to find out,
Congressman Davidson, I'm curious to hear your insights on this as well.
Yeah, thanks for the question. And I think the question for the U.S. isn't whether to hold Bitcoin, but how much. Right. So if you think about it, the whole value of Bitcoin is around $1 trillion right now. A little over, right? $1 trillion. Just in the past year, the Federal Reserve's balance sheet has grown by over $4 trillion. That's the Federal Reserve. So, of course, the U.S. balance sheet, we don't really hold anything. We're some would say already bankrupt, right? We have a lot of debt. So, you don't go into debt, you know, without a bad policy, fiscal policy, and we've got an accompanying monetary policy that's made it bad. And frankly, a lot of that has drove the valuation in Bitcoin. So you've seen people flee the dollar. Ray Dalio, Bridgewater Capital, said cash is trash, right? Why? Because central banks are destroying cash, and they fled. I mean, I think that was one of the things I answered a Forbes comment. Like 3 words describe the rise of crypto: short the dollar. People are moving out of the dollar that's being undermined by our own federal government's spending, prolific spending, in a bipartisan way, and the monetary policy that's enabled it. So I think we should hold it, but I'm concerned when the federal government says, well, we're going to move into a space, right? I mean, right now, the Fed is buying $80 billion worth of treasuries every single month, trying to prop up the treasury market. And they're inflating real estate as if it needed more inflating by buying $40 billion worth of mortgage-backed securities every month, right? So I think you move into the risk of economic distortion. I think most of the people in the room would love for the federal government to buy, $1 trillion worth of Bitcoin, which would double the value of it almost overnight, right? So and most people won't sell, and even as it goes up, they'll count on others selling, and they'll take the appreciation. When you look at the national security implications of that, though, the dollar as the reserve currency has been a massive source of strength, but it's been underpinned by America as the land of opportunity. People didn't come to America because we had this system of control. We came to America because we were a free, open society. Not a place with no laws, but a place with a light regulatory environment where you could come and experience economic opportunity, and if you got it right, prosperity, right? And so much of the world has come here to innovate. And I ran through the list of areas that we've done so well in. And the reality is, if we cling to money as a means of control, we risk having some sort of dystopian future. And you see that in debate today, the government seeking to impose its will on everything. The momentum really since the Patriot Act in particular has been more government and less freedom. And I think we have to flip the script, and we have to have more freedom, less government, and sound money.
For all the panelists, what policy or legislative action would you like to see? And let's bring this kind of back to the local level, the Texas Blockchain Summit, right? So at the Texas level, for Bitcoin adoption, is it in, as Representative Capri-Leon was talking about, a ability to pay taxes in Bitcoin, or is it in sort of the store of value, the rainy day fund that Texas holds for crisis situations, which unfortunately the U.S. does not have something similar, but we have printing presses though, so modern monetary theorists would say that we do have that. I don't think they're very modern monetary theorists in the room, but what would you say is a specific policy suggestion for the state of Texas? And Natalie, we'll start with you and work our way this way.
Sure. I think what we've seen with states like Alaska and Wyoming is that a state-level sovereign wealth fund can work. And I think Bitcoin is the ideal place to start, and Texas should get on that.
Love it. Succinct. Ed?
Adopt early, adopt aggressively. And take that out of the page of corporate America when the pension funds were underfunded 10, 15 years ago, and you saw the funds stopping. Well, what was happening with balance sheets where CFOs were beginning to invest in stocks that were depressed. They rode the market up, took care of the pension problems. This is a simple one. Yes, do it now.
I'm going to answer the question in a little bit of a different way. One of the biggest issues impacting the adoption of Bitcoin is the lack of accounting standards. I know this may sound like eyes just glazing over at this point, but the Financial Accounting Standards Board has failed to issue any type of authoritative rules or guidance on how Bitcoin and digital assets can be accounted for on the balance sheet. And because of that, they're being accounted as intangibles, which is really punitive. And this is one of the biggest reasons why US public and private companies are sitting on the sidelines of putting Bitcoin on the balance sheet. It's a really simple fix. And the leadership within Texas should raise this with the Financial Accounting Standards Board and encourage them and urge them to issue accounting standards for digital assets.
That sounds like something we can help with. We will be doing that. Thank you for providing that advice. Because let's dive into that a little bit more, because they're having to track them as non-cash assets, basically not able to issue debt against them or other things, right? That's part of the problem.
You can't use it as collateral, but really, I mean, it's very punitive for a company, especially a public company, to put crypto on the balance sheet. So they put it on the balance sheet at the price they buy it at. And then if the Bitcoin is relatively volatile, it flows up and down 30 to 40% every month. That's typical. If it goes down, they have to mark their balance sheet down. If the price goes up, they can't. A company cannot realize that gain. So the information and financial statements for companies who have Bitcoin on their balance sheet is no longer clear, and investors can't even use that to really get a clear picture of the value of the assets they hold. So this is truly one of the biggest reasons why corporate and institutional investors are sitting on the sidelines today. It's a simple fix.
Yep.
Alex?
Yeah, I mean, look, Bitcoin is open source money controlled by its users and not by corporations or governments. And I think it's going to be essential for us so that we can preserve the American values in the future of civil liberties and free speech and the ability to conduct commerce with each other in a way that's not too heavily restricted by the government. And to do so, we're going to need Bitcoin as legal tender eventually. And I don't think it should be forced. I would not agree with what the government of El Salvador did in making it sort of forced. I think it should be optional. But I think anyone should be able to use it if a merchant wants to accept it and a person wants to pay for it. They shouldn't have to pay capital gains on Bitcoin as a currency. And I think they also should be able to pay their debt back with it if they wish. So that's kind of like the one thing I'd like to see happen at a community level, at a state level. Maybe it starts with cities. And I also just want to say very briefly that the control the U.S. had over the world was eroding anyway, aside from Bitcoin. I mean, the reserves that other countries held in dollars had already dwindled from 80% to 60%, basically before Bitcoin had its rise. Putin and Xi Jinping, they're already doing business with each other. Forget Bitcoin. Like this apex dominance that America had over the world is slipping away. And I don't think it's fair to blame Bitcoin for that. I think, as Congressman Davidson has said, you might want to blame our own policies for that, where we've been excessive in maybe monetary spending or in foreign policy. So we need to take a hard look at ourselves first before we blame other people for the decline of the dollar. And hopefully we'll build a new system where, our economy is underpinned by something, again, that matches our values.
Congressman Davidson, we're gonna close with your remarks, some specific policy, and you're sitting in a seat in Congress to actually make some of these happen. In addition to that, I know Ohio was accepting Bitcoin as a payment for taxes many years before this was a conversation in Texas. So you guys have walked down this road. What are some specific policy recommendations that you have?
Yeah, so look, first, part of the reason Texas has a reserve is Texas and most states have a balanced budget, right? They have a requirement, according to your state constitution, to balance the budget. The federal government doesn't have the same constraint. And you can't have sound money without books that balance. So you have to have a form of sound money. States can do those things. At the federal level, we have to get back to that. I mean, you could debate about revenue or spending. In my view, you have to get rid of the 16th Amendment, quit invading everyone's privacy, and using a very inefficient tax system on income, and go to a consumption-oriented tax. Go back to the federal government cuts checks only to states, not to everyone else, and then states have more control of it. And then what should the states do with that? They should do, good governments defend freedom. They should do more freedom, less government, and sound money. And in Ohio, what would that look like? Well, I would say one of the most important metrics for the country is, does this policy get more people involved in the workforce, or does it discourage participation in the economy? And we have so many policies that are structurally creating incentives to not participate in the workforce or participate in the economy. And we have to look at those and say, systemically, if we dismantle those things, not because we hate people, we love people, we want them to flourish. and they flourish when they can actually participate in the economic vitality of our country. Bitcoin is doing that around the world. And if you look right here in Austin, there's a company, BankU, that just with SMS messages, and they're not doing it in America because their banking laws would make it impossible, but they're establishing payment systems and digital identities for people who can, get their freedom from an oppressive regime, or maybe where women don't have the same rights, people that can't keep their own property. Just by SMS messages, they can do it. And if you think about how do we adapt to a future where we can't use money as a system of control, if you go back to how did we win the Cold War? Well, we had our financial system for sure, but if you think about like Voice of America, we got the truth past the Iron Curtain into the ears of people, and we didn't tear their wall down, they tore their own wall down, right? Because they found out the truth of what was on the other side. It was a lot more prosperity and opportunity. And if you think about that in the work that, whether it's foreign aid or nonprofits or anything else, if you can bypass the middlemen and you can get the assistance directly to the people, think how you could transform our State Department, which frankly should be overhauled at every level anyway. Go back to it, more freedom, less government, sound money, good governments defend freedom, and put that as our foreign policy, and we can do that all with a Bitcoin or Bitcoin similar architecture that is truly decentralized and distributed ledger technology. So if you have a central control, central authority, eventually you're going to have some bad humans that will abuse it. Mm-hmm. And that's really the creepiest surveillance tool known to man is what China's developing, is that exact tool, central bank digital currencies. And I think that's the policy fight of our era, is if the federal government develops a digital dollar and does it the same way China does, I mean, this whole planet's going to be pretty rough. But if we defend freedom with our money and we have a true restoration of privacy in our financial system, like Bitcoin enables, then we can continue to defend freedom.
Profound. Very profound. Ladies and gentlemen, join me in thanking our distinguished panelists.